Today we have the pleasure to welcome Karl-Dieter up at IAS. He is an associate professor at the University of Washington and a professor emeritus at Leipzig University. After receiving his PhD from the University of Cologne, he has worked at and visited many institutions and places all over, but amongst them are Germany, the Netherlands, the US, Switzerland. Among the many places and university he's been to are the University of Cologne, Nuffield, the New School for Social Research in New York, and of course my favorite, the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. In his career, he has published numerous articles, textbooks, and chapters in prestigious journals and beyond. His research interests are very broadly circling around social movements and political protests, via behavior, norms, the emergence of such, and their changes and effects. Today, he will present his paper on structural balance, social networks, and the diffusion of innovations. And Dissonance Theory explain the Protestant Reformation. We're very, very excited to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me first try. So can everybody see my slides? And
yeah, looks good.
Okay, so then I start. The question I will address is to what extent balance theory can be used as a theoretical foundation for explaining the formation of social networks and their impact on the diffusion of innovations. To answer this question, I will analyze the diffusion of the Protestant Reformation. Recent research shows that social networks were an important factor for the spread of the Reformation. The issue thus is to assess the fruitfulness of balance theory for explaining a specific long-term process. Such studies are so far missing, so the focus is on balance theory. The result of the following analysis is that balance theory is a fruitful theory, but it cannot adequately explain the impact of certain kinds of social structures. I suggest a modification of balance theory by applying another theory. It has been suggested that a purposive actor model should be applied. I show that this idea leads to a fruitful modification of balance theory. The analysis is thus a theoretical integration of two theories. So you will ask, why choosing balance theory? There are several reasons. First of all, it explicitly models relationships between actors and can thus be applied to explain the formation and effects of social networks. Many studies in the network literature lack a systematic application of a theory. Balance theory might thus also contribute to improve the analysis of social networks. Balance theory looks at relations of actors and non-personal objects, as you will see in a minute, and a non-personal object is a belief system. And these non-personal objects are relevant for the diffusion of innovations. Innovations refer to non-personal objects. Furthermore, balance theory is relatively well confirmed, but there are falsifications. As for every, or be careful, for almost every theory in the social sciences. However, I rely on an assessment by two colleagues in a recent article about balance theory, and they state that balance theory, I quote, has been elaborated over generations of investigators. It continues to advance in work by sociologists and investigators in the natural and engineering sciences with publications in premier general scientific journals. And such elaborations include work from social psychology and sociology. It is thus worthwhile to try to examine the fruitfulness of balance theory by applying it to a complex real process, namely the fusion of the Reformation. Applying balance theory to this case can answer the following questions. The first is, does balance theory confirm the explanation of the Protestant Reformation that I will discuss? Second, does balance theory add new additional hypotheses to this explanation? Third, does balance theory require modifications of this explanation? And does the application of balance theory show problems of balance theory itself? And if so, how can balance theory modify it? The contents of the presentation are in more detail. I start with an introduction to balance theory, then an introduction to the diffusion of the Protestant Reformation and its explanation. Then I will show how the Protestant Reformation or its diffusion can be modeled with balance theory. And the final part is about a deviant case and its explanation with what I call a conditional version of balance theory. And then finally, some points for the discussion. The first article about balance theory is from 1946 by Fritz Heider, Attitudes and Cognitive Organization. And worth reading is also the book from 1958, where he presents the theory again and comments on it. And the title is The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations. Subsequent work is in particular a paper by Cartwright and Terrari, 1956. This is actually a formalization of Heider's theory, and he uses, or the authors use, graph theory. Then my favorite old article is by James Davies, and it's still worth reading, from 1963. And the title sounds sociological: Structural Balance, Mechanical Solidarity, and Interpersonal Relations. It's what he called restatement of 56 hypotheses from sociology and social psychology. Actually, he applies balance theory to derive these 56 hypotheses. A more recent review is by Peter A. Bell, and but he focuses on the formal aspects of balance theory. My favorite recent article is by Rawlings and Friedkin. The title is The Structural Balance Theory of Sentiment Networks, Elaboration and Test. So I want to apply balance theory, but the question is, what is this balance theory? What is the theory of structural balance? The problem is that there is not a clear, generally accepted version of balance theory. It almost seems that every author has his own version of balance theory. There is, however, a set of propositions that most authors apply, and these are hypotheses from the classic model, as Rawlings and Friedkin call it, and that is the model based on Heider and on the paper by Cartwright and Terrari. So these are really the two most influential articles still today. I apply these propositions and add some other plausible hypotheses from the literature that seem fruitful to explain the Protestant Reformation. Some basic concepts about balance theory. Balance theory deals with relationships between objects. And these relationships are depicted by graphs, and this here is an example. So you see here in this graph, you have objects. And these objects are persons or personal objects. Luther, to anticipate the Protestant Reformation, Luther, then several groups of actors. P means positive towards the Reformation, N means negative towards the Reformation. So you have personal and non-personal actors, and you have relations. These are symbolized by lines, and they may be more or less intensive. So I just distinguish relatively intensive relations, thick lines, and less intensive, thin lines. Heider distinguishes two kinds of relations. One is liking, so for example, admiring somebody, approving somebody, or loving somebody. Or unit relations, to possess something, to believe in something. For example, here, this could be a unit relation. Luther is a proponent or believes in the Reformation, and maybe this is also liking relation. That means Luther likes, of course, the Reformation. I assume that there are symmetric relations. That means if A likes B, then B likes A as well. We can discuss that later. So this is practical, and balance theory would assume that if relations are not symmetric, then there is imbalance, and that leads then to symmetric relations. But anyway, I assume symmetric relations. Relations may be positive, and these are the solid lines, or negative. So Luther had a positive relation to the Reformation, but group AN has a strong negative relation to the Reformation. An important concept is a cycle, and a cycle is a set of relations that begins and ends with the same object. So 1, 9, 4 is a cycle. 1, 9, 4 is a cycle, beginning and end with the same objects. Another cycle is L, R, this 1, 9, 10, 8, 6. This is a much longer cycle, but it's a cycle. And the value of a cycle is the product of the values of the lines. And I assume that, and Haider assumes that as well, and Cartwright and Harari, that positive lines are +1, are assigned +1, and negative lines -1. So look at this cycle, and this cycle is never negative. Plus times minus is minus, times plus is minus. But this cycle here is positive. So minus times minus is plus, times plus is plus. A cycle with a positive value is balanced. So this cycle is balanced. With a negative cycle, it's unbalanced. So a graph is balanced if all of its cycles are positive. So a graph can be balanced or not balanced, and degree of balance of a graph is the number of positive cycles divided by the number of negative, divided by the total number of cycles. So degree of balance of a graph is the number of positive cycles divided by the total number of cycles. Now, the propositions that I will apply. The major proposition is the balance proposition. There is a tendency for cognitive units to achieve a balanced state, And that means if there is imbalance, then it's likely that there will be later a balanced state. It is further assumed that imbalance is related to tension and balance to satisfaction. Balance can be achieved by adding or deleting lines or by changing the signs of lines. And this happens through action or cognitive reorganization. And it's important that you keep that in mind. If there is imbalance, then there is action or cognitive reorganization to bring about balance if there's imbalance. And further, there is a tendency toward positivity. That means there is, I quote, a marked preference for forming positive bonds rather than negative ones. So maybe you may keep in mind people are reluctant to change negative lines to positive lines. They prefer to change positive, negative, but they prefer to change negative to positive lines. This is a positivity proposition. There is further a tendency toward completeness. I quote, if two entities are not interrelated in the structure, then a bond will tend to be induced to appear between them. So that means if a line is missing, there is a tendency that this line will be brought about. Finally, there is a tendency to change as few lines as possible and to change weak lines for a changing balance. So people prefer to change weak lines to changing strong, intense lines. Let me finish this part with a nice illustration taken from Davis' paper that I mentioned, and that refers to Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet. And Shakespeare describes the following situation. You have Juliet and Romeo, and this is a positive liking relation. They like each other, and Romeo has the name Montague. So this is a unit relation, and perhaps it's a liking relation. Perhaps Romeo likes this name, but Juliet hates this name. So this is a negative, a disliking relation. And I think Shakespeare didn't know balance theory, but he describes the situation in the following way. Juliet muses, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? This but thy name, that is my enemy." So this is clearly this negative relation that is the enemy of Juliet. Now, let me turn to the diffusion of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. What follows is largely based on a recent paper by Sascha Becker, Johann Sciaio, Stephen Pfaff, and Jared Rubin from 2020. And its title is Multiplex Network Ties and the Spatial Diffusion of Radical Innovations, Martin Luther's Readership and in the Early Information. The authors propose a new explanation of the diffusion of the Reformation, and they provide a new analysis of data about the Reformation that confirms their explanation. Some background information: the Reformation took place in the 16th century in Europe, and the major religion at that time was the Roman Catholic Church. The central actor who initiated the Reformation was Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar and a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. And the Reformation began in Germany in Wittenberg. Luther's doctrines became most popular after he posted 95 theses at the Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1517. Here he criticized mainly the practice of indulgences, And that means the following: the Catholic Church sold certificates. And in these certificates, it was guaranteed that all your sins were forgiven. So if you bought a certificate, then that meant you are clean, there's a remission of all your sins. I mean, nowadays, that would be a fantastic product to sell for Amazon, but at that time, there was no Amazon. So this posting of the 95 theses was a major event, I quote, generating a random shock that spread concentrically around Wittenberg. Here are two pictures. One is the door where, it's a recent picture, the door of the Schlosskirche of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, where Luther posted his 95 theses, and this is a picture of Luther. Here is the area in Germany where Luther spent most of his life, and Wittenberg is the major location. Erfurt is important as well, Worms and so on. I will talk about some of these locations later. You see, this is the middle of Germany, and Hamburg, where I'm now talking, is here, and Munich is down here. So, and in these, if you travel through Germany and go through visit these cities, you everywhere have some remembrance of Luther. So what were the major reasons for the Reformation? The first was dissatisfaction with the sale of indulgences. Then there was corruption, such as simony, and this is the sale of church offices to unqualified people. So in 1487, the Pope sold 24 positions as bishops or cardinals to unqualified people. It was also known that many church officials often did not work, but only got paid for their position. Taxes were raised by the Catholic Church. One had to pay 1/10 the tithes of his or her income. And there were gross violations of major moral norms that the Catholic Church held. For example, Pope Alexander VI had numerous affairs and children out of wedlock. Also, it's estimated that 20% of all priests in the Diocese of Trent kept concubines during the early 16th century. Spreading Protestantism is a stepwise provision of a good, and this good is the rigid Protestantism. The units are converted individuals or groups or entire cities. So what you can read in the literature is that entire cities converted to Protestantism. Such additional units are visible. Compare this with reducing CO2 emission. Assume you decide not to take a plane and your seat remains empty. You will not notice the tiny amount of CO2 reduction that you caused, but having converted a person, you really see that Protestantism spread a little bit. And the consequence is that perceived influence to spread Protestantism is not zero, or most of the time not zero. Converting one person is a visible influence to spread Protestantism. And perceived influence is a major variable in the theory of collective action for participating in the provision of this good. A major explanatory factor for the diffusion of the Reformation were the activities of Martin Luther. He was hyper-influential. He had persuasive skills, fame, and engaged, I quote, in indefatigable efforts to convince others. He has also been described as a charismatic leader. Luther engaged in particular in extensive correspondence, and his letters are still available, and Becker and co-authors analyzed these letters again. Then distribution of printed material. At that time, the printing press was invented already. And Luther did extensive traveling. He approached groups or individuals, gave talks, and participated in numerous public disputations. Luther had many adherents who were also active in spreading his ideas. In particular, he had merchants. For them, the Reformation was, I quote, good for business, and adopting the Reformation promised an end to restrictions of labor commerce. This is a paper by Wurtz and others. So other adherents were cities. As I said, entire cities were converted by Luther. They supported Luther. And Luther had many students from other universities who wanted to study with him. Luther felt a strong moral indignation about doctrines and behavior of the Catholic Church. And he felt obliged to fight for his convictions. In a book by Bainton, there is an English translation of one of the famous statements of Luther, where you can see what his moral obligation is or how strong it is. And Luther states in German, of course, and you have afterwards, if you are German or speak German, this is translation. So this is English now. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything. For to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand. A clearer statement of his moral conviction is hardly possible. And it's plausible that those moral concerns were held by followers of Luther as well. So there were opponents of Luther, strong opponents, and in particular the Catholic Church that tried to stifle the movement. But all the measures were not successful. A particularly spectacular event was Luther's appearance as ordered before the Diet of Worms, and this Diet of Worms was a general assembly of the estates of the Holy Roman Empire in 1521, so 4 years after the posting of the 95 Theses. But Luther refused the demand of Charles V, and he was a Holy Roman Emperor, to recant his teaching. Charles V, I quote, forbade anyone to receive Luther and promised a generous reward for his capture. However, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, hit Luther at the Wartburg Castle. Luther thus had almost strong supporters. Becker and co-authors strongly emphasize the role of social networks. The proposition is that networks, so these are of course relations between actors, provide the possibility for the transmission of information and of reinforcement. Keep in mind this distinction in transmission of information and reinforcement, and the latter means that actors are exposed to rewards or punishments for performing actions or for adopting beliefs. In other words, networks are pathways or channels of information and peer pressure. So it's important to keep in mind that networks are thus not incentives, they are transmission possibilities. The kinds of networks, the kinds of pathways influence the costs of the transmission. Compare the modern internet, social media and so on, with the situation at the time of Luther. An example, assume you would like to deliver a personal message from Erfurt in Germany to the courier in Rome today and in the 16th century. So you have to go to Rome. What would you do today? You take a plane from Stockholm, Hamburg, or from wherever to Rome and then deliver your message. What happened in the 16th century? So Luther traveled to Rome, and this is what he did. He walked here from Erfurt, south, down. This is the way to Rome, here, this way, over the Alps, down here, and to Rome, and back this way. I quote, he walked 700 miles through a harsh winter over the Alps and down the spine of Italy on a pilgrim's trail just like this. Way to Rome, 8 weeks, back 7 weeks. And in general, people traveled by foot, horse-drawn carriages or ship, and roads were in a bad shape. So this was a situation of networks in Germany at that time. So the example shows that the geographical distance was an important feature of networks at Luther's time. The greater the spatial distance was between actors, the higher were the costs of transmission. As the example of Luther indicates, the speed of transmission was low and the required resources for transmissions were high. So you had to have the time to travel these long distances. The spread of a message is less costly if a given network can be used for different kinds of messages for different purposes. Regarding the spread of the Reformation, merchants had business relations. They thus used their network for a certain purpose. These merchants also used their contacts for spreading Protestantism. In general, thus, the costs of transmitting a message decrease if the network is used for multiple messages. There were thus pre-existing networks that promoted the spread of the Reformation. The conclusion is that at the time of Luther, the transmission of information and reinforcement was costly compared to today. But this did not prevent the transmission of the Reformation. It probably took a relatively long time for its diffusion, compared with how it would spread today. Becker distinguished, and this is based on the work of Centola. Look at, if you are interested, at his 2 books from 2018 and 2021, and he has written several articles as well. And the distinction is between 2 kinds of contagions. The first is simple contagions. That means catching a flu or spread information. If one person in a network has the flu and sneezes on me, I quote, I may catch it. If I in turn sneeze on others, they can also become infected. So one contact is sufficient, and Centola nicely remarks, at no point did anyone need to be convinced to get sick. The second kind of contagion is complex contagions. They refer to costly behavioral or costly cognitive changes. They require, I quote, contact with multiple sources of reinforcement in order to be transmitted. This condition is fulfilled if there are clusters of actors, close-knit groups, or multiplex networks, and these are networks consisting of people from different social contexts, for example, from the workplace or from leisure groups. It is further held that personal contacts and not diffusion of printed material mattered most for the diffusion of the Reformation. The transmission of Reformation is, no question, a complex contagion. Adoption is a costly behavior and a costly cognitive change. The implication from the foregoing argument is that Protestantism could only diffuse if there was a multiplex network structure. And this is exactly a finding of Becker and his co-authors. The diffusion of the Reformation was a multi-stage process. For example, cities, I quote, created local social reinforcement. You know, reinforcement is important, that persuaded further cities to adopt, even if they were not directly under Luther's influence. This yielded a further multiple reinforcement. And the authors call these a wildfire effect. Becker and co-authors summarized their argument in the following way. Our argument is that personal relational diffusion via Luther's multiplex ties combined with spatial structural diffusion via trade routes to help Protestantism's early breakthrough from a regional reform movement to a general rebellion against the Catholic Church. Note that the explanation so far does not address the cognitive structure of actors. The implication seems to be that multiplex networks are effective for the spread of Reformation, regardless of the kinds of people. Assume, for example, that these people who are to be changed or converted are not Catholics, maybe they are Muslims or they are terrorists. Would just an exposure work? The implicit assumption probably is that existing cognitive structures are similar in this case to transmitted cognitive structures. And regarding Protestantism and Catholicism, this is plausible because both religions had much in common, such as the belief in one God. And this is acknowledged when the authors write, I quote, "The resistance to diffusions," I add this, "will be especially great where heterodox ideas compete against an incumbent orthodoxy. The heterodoxy, that means dissimilarity of the ideas of Catholicism and Protestantism, would, if it existed, thus hinder the diffusion of the Reformation." So if they were really different, but a detailed analysis of the two belief systems is not provided. The diffusion process resembles very much Hedström's and co-authors' model of the spatial diffusion of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. The authors explore the network of social democratic agitators or charismatic leaders who could generate considerable support for their cause. Similar to Martin Luther, there was a famous speech comparable to the 95 Theses that initiated the diffusion of the movement. August Palm, the name of this person, I quote, began to travel around Sweden, agitating for the social democratic cause. He was soon to be followed by other agitators, likewise enthusiastic and convinced individuals. They were people with a mission, and this sounds very much like the spread of the Reformation. It would be very interesting to look in detail at the mechanisms of these two kinds of diffusion processes. Now, can balance theory be applied to explain the diffusion of the Protestant Reformation? So this is a graph, and here at the upper part of a graph, that should be the Protestant belief system, and it should consist here of 4 items. I limit it to 4 items, but it wouldn't matter if there are more items. There are, of course, more items. But let's assume that there are just 4 items. And to add some substance here, I assume that these are all doctrines of Luther. And R1 means indulgences cannot forgive sins. R2, priests should be allowed to marry. R3, church fees and taxes are unacceptable. And R4, the Pope does not have an absolute authority. You see here, all the R's are connected. So I assume for the time being that that is a unit for the actors. But you could change this situation, for example, by delete lines or by add negative lines. So all this can be analyzed with balance theory, as you will see later. This is a graph, I would call it a graph with skeptics. So here you see P, O2, O1, these are the actors, and you see, of course, Luther has positive relations to all the items, and I assume O2 is a supporter of Luther, and he has also positive relations to O1. And you see here, O1 is a skeptic, and that means he accepts some teachings of Luther here, but not others. So he disagrees with R2 and he disagrees with R1. So they are skeptics. These are not thick lines. You see, these are thin lines. And in this case, there is imbalance. There is imbalance. And especially look at this P R1O1P here, P R1O1P. So two positive lines, one negative. This is imbalance. Plus times plus is plus times minus is minus. And there's another unbalanced cycle. And this is P here, PR2O2P. And again, this is unbalanced, two positive lines, one negative line. And balance theory suggests, due to the positivity proposition, that the negative lines will be changed so that O1 here will accept these two items as well. The Reformation will spread if O1, O2, and of course P have further context. So we had actually to add here other graphs, but what I will not do. The graph depicts one type of situation. As I said, rejection of R is not very strong, and many people accept the Reformation. So these are the O2, at least in part, and this seems a realistic description of the situation. Remember, there was high discontent, and it seems that many people were just skeptics and not really severe opponents of Luther. But there are other groups, certainly, who are strong believers, for example, adherents of the Curia. So this would be a situation where O1 has very strong negative relations to R1. So O1 doesn't believe anything what Luther teaches. And furthermore, O1 hates P and assume P hates O1 too. And here O1 has negative relation to O2. So this is actually conflict. You have people who accept the Reformation, and here he does not. And there is balance. Look, O1, R4, R3. Two negative lines here and one positive line. Minus times minus is plus, times plus is plus. So you see, all these cycles are positive. And balance theory predicts that there will be no changes. So this will be a stable situation. And there are certainly groups, or there have been groups in the Reformation that match this situation. And this suggests that Catholicism still exists, so not everybody was converted. There are still other situations. For example, cognitive elements might be less connected. Here, for example, relations of O to R might be partly strong or partly weak, and other actors O could be added. But I will not further go into the details here. What I want to show is that those situations, however you change them, can be modeled with balance theory. And it's important to note that balance theory addresses the impact of social and cognitive structure. So that would be the social structure, and that would be the cognitive structures. Are the network propositions of Becker and co-authors compatible with balance theory? The authors emphasize the importance of close-knit groups, multiple reinforcements, relevance of personal context, the assumption that cognitive structures can be neglected. What are the implications from balance theory? First of all, do close-knit groups promote the diffusion of innovation? The first, if you apply balance theory, is always to formulate certain definitions in terms of balance theory. So what does a close-knit group mean if you apply balance theory? Close-knit groups could be a graph consisting of individuals who are connected. Each is connected to everyone else. And answer the question to what extent such a group is likely to adopt innovations, we need to include R, because this is the Reformation, and the question is to what extent that will be accepted if there are close-knit groups. So look at this graph again. You have 4 personal objects and the Reformation, and O1 doesn't accept R, but P does accept R. So you have one negative cycle, that is this one, all positive, one negative, and this is imbalance, and so OR1 will be changed. So this is certainly not a closed-net group, but this is a closed-net group. And there are many relations. Everyone is related to everyone or to everything else. There are here 8 positive cycles. So, for example, this is a positive cycle. And I hope you believe me that I counted it correctly. And there are 7 negative cycles. For example, one is this one. So, and balance theory would suggest that OR1 will be changed. The conclusion is that members of the close-knit group can considerably reduce tension, 7 negative cycles, and increase balance when they adopt R. So this changes 7 negative cycles. Change of OR1 is likely. And furthermore, the new negative line is unlikely because tensions due to more negative cycles will originate. So that fits nicely with the hypothesis that close-knit groups promote the diffusion of innovations. What about multiple reinforcement? Let's start with this graph. So Luther, Reformation, and O1, and now we focus on O1. There is a negative cycle, so there is imbalance. So what does reinforcement mean? Reinforcement means by definition that there is an object X, such as approval, that a person P gives or provides to another person O1 for accepting something. So that means a person provides an object to another person for doing something. So this is usually what is understood by a reinforcement. Now look at the upper graph here. Assume that P provides reinforcement X1 to O. So what I just said is presented here by this line. P gives the reinforcement for the Reformation, and O1 gets this reinforcement. So you have here 2 negative cycles, for example, this one, not for example, this one and this one, and you have 3 new positive cycles, for example, this one. So now assume there is another reinforcement. So the question is, how do multiple reinforcements work? And this is here X2. And assume another person provides the reinforcement, and this is here O2. So again, a reinforcement for O1. That means O1 provides X2 to O1 for the Reformation. There are now 3 new negative cycles, but now 8 new positive cycles. You can see all the cycles with the red lines. For example, with O2, that would be a new positive cycle. So the conclusion is that additional reinforcements lead to new negative cycles because the negative line OR1, look here, the negative line of O1 to R is a component of many cycles. So new reinforcements add new cycles, and so also new negative cycles. And additional reinforcements lead to many new positive cycles, and thus to higher satisfaction. That means adopting R reduces tension and adds satisfaction to a relatively high extent if many reinforcements, or if more than one or several reinforcements are provided. That means multiple reinforcements thus promote innovations. That means multiple reinforcements make it more likely that O1R is changed. Relevance of personal contacts. So let's assume here there is non-personal contact, that Luther just writes a message to O, maybe by mail, and that could be forwarded by post. Also at Luther's time, there was a post, and that is a personal encounter, and assume in terms of balance theory that this is a strong relationship. So non-personal contact, personal contact. And if this is the correct conceptual analysis, then the strong relation between Luther and O makes a change of the negative line from O to R more likely and adds more satisfaction. So here you have two thick lines, and that change leads in total to more satisfaction than if you change another one. So then the neglect of cognitive structures in the explanation of Becker and others. So what they provide is what Larson and co-authors call the assumption of an influence by exposure process. Influence by exposure process. And you find that in many network analysis, where it is simply assumed that people are exposed to something and then they accept it. But as we showed before here with balance theory, the cognitive structure is important. So it depends on the cognitive structure, what happens, and on the other social structure as well. So there are actually interactions in balance theory of the cognitive and the social structure. And this is also plausible. Assume Luther approaches a strong adherent to Islam. Simple exposure to Protestantism will not change the religious beliefs of this person. So all this works in this case because Protestantism and Catholicism were relatively similar, and because there was large grievances in regard to Catholicism. So this works because this assumption here that there are great similarities between the two belief systems holds true. Conclusion: the previous analysis shows that balance theory can be applied to explain the diffusion of the Reformation, and furthermore, it improves, that means it corrects the explanation by Becker and co-authors. And it was further shown that quite different situations can be modeled with balance theory, and it seems plausible that other large-scale diffusion processes could be modeled. And as I said, the work with by Hedström and others could be used to apply balance theory as well. So nobody is perfect and no theory is perfect. And in my work on the Protestant Reformation, I encountered a case that did not fit with balance theory. Look at this situation A here. You have Luther, a group O, and the Reformation, and Luther and the group, they dislike each other. The group dislikes the Reformation, but of course Luther likes the Reformation. So normally, assume you are here one of these persons, you would feel nicely, you would feel fine. So you dislike somebody and you find that this person you dislike had some different opinions. This is a fine situation. You would not feel tension, you would feel satisfaction. Now, look at Luther. The goal of Luther is to spread the Reformation. So O's disbelief, this negative line here, raises strong dissatisfaction of Luther. He doesn't like this negative line at all. So that means you have balance and an unbalanced and an unpleasant state. Furthermore, for Luther, all these negative lines from an actor to the Reformation are highly dissatisfying, being these lines in balanced or unbalanced cycle. So I think this is, in this case at least, a case that falsifies the theory. And now assume that Luther has converted O. And this now is an unbalanced situation. So you have two positive and one negative line. However, Luther's goal is not to have nice relations to others. Luther's goal is to promote the Reformation. And so Luther might not care whether group O likes him or whether he likes group O. So that means that this is imbalance and for Luther a pleasant state. Now let's replace Luther with a merchant. And the merchant has not the goal to convert other people. So his propagation of the Reformation is a byproduct of his business negotiation. So the merchants want to do business and not mainly spread the Reformation. And it seems that this situation is really in line with balance theory. So there is balance here and a pleasant state exists. And this is a situation that satisfies everybody. So all relations are positive. So do situation A, balance and tension, and situation B, imbalance and satisfaction, falsify balance theory? The answer depends on how balance theory is formulated. I distinguish three versions of balance theory. Many accounts of balance theory posit that certain cognitive structures or configurations of sentiments are defined as balance. There is no reference to psychic states. And this is the version that is based on Cartwright and Harari's formalization of Haider theory. If you read that article, no psychic states are involved. Bonasich and Liu in an introduction to mathematical sociology give a good characterization of this version. They write, you are given a set of people and relationships, but other than the dots and lines in your graph, you really don't know anything else about the people. All you know is the structure of relations. So this version of balance theory could be called the structural version. Imbalance leads to action and cognitive reorganization, and that leads to balance. So, and the graph that I showed, that falsifies the situation. So here, balance leads to action and cognitive relation for Luther, and not imbalance. So this is apparently a falsification of the structural version. Let's stick to graph A, not to the other ones. So in next version is, in many accounts of balance theory, it is assumed that unbalanced structures produce tension. That this formulation is from Haider, produce tension. And this is the version of balance theory by Haider. Tension is thus an intervening variable between certain structures on the one hand and action or cognitive reorganization on the other. And this version can be called the social psychological version, and it can be formulated in the following way. So imbalance leads to tension, that leads to action or cognitive reorganization, that leads to balance, and balance then, if balance is reached, then tension is reduced. And this is the key, I quote, the key postulate of structural balance theory, at least the key postulate of this classic version by Haider. It is, I quote, that felt tensions are induced by structural forms of a group. Are induced, mean like a cause, so imbalance, so action are caused by tension. The social psychological version is also falsified by graph A because this situation should not lead to tension, but it does. There is a third version, and the hypothesis is that there is not an empirical effect of cognitive structures on tensions. Balance or imbalance affect behavior or cognitive reorganization only if these states are related to satisfaction or tension. And this can be called the conditional version of balance theory. So we can formulate it in the following way: imbalance and balance per se don't lead to action and or cognitive reorganization, only if they are associated with tension. So imbalance or balance and tension lead to action or cognitive reorganization, and that leads to changes of the structures that reduce tension. So I would call this is a conditional balance theory. So conditional, that means balance is conditional on the existence of tension. Note the difference to the social psychological version here. Imbalance leads to tension, and tension is an effect. Tension is an effect of imbalance, and here tension is a condition for action and cognitive reorganization. So I distinguish three versions of balance theory: the structural versions, no psychic characteristics are involved, just structures matter. Social psychological version, imbalance leads to tension. Tension is an intervening variable, and the conditional version, imbalance and tensions matter for actions of cognitive organization. I think that dissonance theory refers exactly to this kind of balance theory. In the work of Festinger, he defines difference as relations among cognitions, so structures. The existence of dissonance, again, relations among cognitions, being psychological uncomfortable. So if these relations and if the relations are uncomfortable, will motivate the person to try to reduce the dissonance to achieve consonance. That implies that relations of a certain kind do not lead to discomfort, but if there are certain relations and if they are uncomfortable, then a person is motivated to achieve consonance. So just aside, Festinger's book was from 1957, and the article by Haider from 1956, and his book from 1958. And Festinger cites Haider, and Haider cites Festinger, but they do not provide a discussion of the theory. They just cite it. Very interesting. So assume there are tensions. The question now arises, how do tensions influence action and cognitive reorganization? Just say, oh, there are tensions, yeah, interesting, and they lead to action and cognitive reorganization. One would like to have more specific theoretical propositions. And a plausible theoretical idea to answer these questions, how do tensions influence action and cognitive reorganization, is formulated in this article by Rawlings and Friedkin. And they write, I quote, the evidence of their research supports the assumption of purposeful actors who alter sentiments on the basis of the relative tension reduction payoffs of converting particular sentiments. The assumption of purposeful actors means that actors have goals, such as Luther, they want to realize. The tension reduction payoffs are payoffs of actions or cognitive reorganizations that are expected to reduce tensions. Reduction of tensions is a payoff. And these expectations are beliefs. So here there are cognitive expectations and they are beliefs about behavioral consequences of actions or cognitive reorganizations. So this is actually a cost-benefit or rational choice approach. And the previous idea is completely consistent with the social psychological value expectancy, or sometimes also called expectancy value theory. Very briefly, this theory holds that actors choose the behavior they perform from the perceived behavioral alternatives. And the alternative is chosen that has the most positive consequences. Positive consequences mean consequences with high positive utilities and that are expected to a high extent. So this is very, very briefly what value expectancy is. Now, the previous idea is consistent with the assumption of purposeful actor means that people have goals, and these are the utilities of the behavioral consequences. Consideration of tension reduction payoffs of a behavior refers to expected consequences of a behavior, that is, beliefs regarding tension reduction. And the quotation further suggests that people choose the action that seems best suited to reach their goals. So it seems that this theory, value expectancy theory, is completely compatible with the purposive actor model. And also it seems that it can be added just instead of saying tensions are important. So the theory can say when tensions lead to which action or which cognitive reorganization. So there is one problem, or might be one problem. Value expectancy is normally applied to explain behavior. Can it explain cognitive reorganization? For example, a change of belief or reformation. cognitive reorganization is a kind of action. Already Max Weber argued that there is inner action and as äußeres Tun, external action. And thinking, believing are examples for inner action. And the hypothesis of balance theory that tensions lead, among other things, to cognitive reorganization implies that the reduction of tensions is a motivation for changing beliefs. One will thus adopt beliefs that are particularly beneficial to reduce tensions to the highest extent. And this implies that a belief change depends on costs and benefits. This is controversial, especially Raymond Boudon argues in several papers, I think also in books, that beliefs cannot be explained by costs and benefits, but what I have said before, that is not consistent with Boudon's claims. So just to illustrate, adopting Protestantism, is that related to some benefits? So the major benefit seems to be satisfaction, an internal reward of changing a belief that is regarded as wrong. So if you believe something and then all of a sudden note that this apparently is wrong and you keep it, then this is a cost. So changing a belief that is regarded as wrong is a benefit. Then adopting Protestantism has various other rewards. For example, external rewards from friends, that would be a benefit. Getting a material incentive, safe taxes, think of what I said about the merchants, that is of course a benefit. Gaining Luther's sympathy and that of other Protestant benefits, but there are costs, negative sanctions from friends who are Catholic, and having some internal tension about giving up Catholicism. So it seems plausible that adopting a belief system is connected with rewards and with punishments. So next task is now to analyze other falsifications of balance theory and examine to what extent the conditional version of balance theory can explain them. So the literature on balance theory has several falsifications, and even Haider in his book points to exceptions. It's nice if you have a theory that doesn't work, you simply say these are exceptions, and then you turn to your next point. But he never suggests a modification of the theory. That is a very strange procedure. So if I would propose a theory and I find exceptions, I would be very dissatisfied and would try to change the theory. But Haider simply says, oh yeah, this is an exception, and he doesn't change the theory. So, wait a moment. Yeah. So I selected several cases to check whether balance theory and or the conditional version can be explained. So I looked in detail at the Luther example, and then another example are norms. So there are unbalanced structures, but who are consistent with norms, and so these structures are satisfying. How can you explain that with the purpose of actor models? So there's some work by Mayos and others about international relations, that here some relations or some situations are not consistent with balance theory. Then Rawlings and Friedkin assume that community commitment is a falsification of balance theory. That is, commitment means that you want all relations between actors are positive, and if there is a negative relation, even if there is balance, that is frustrating. So, and can relations be introduced for external reasons from balance theory? So now the question is, I need another afternoon to go through all these cases, and I will skip this part because of time constraints, and I just want to go to a few points of the discussion. So I just said before to Karl-Dieter that I will send a copy of this presentation to Laura, or somebody I will send to Karl-Dieter, and you may send it around. So if you are interested, you can look at these parts that I omitted. So The first question you may ask is, if the purposive actor model is so good, why do we need balance theory? Why not give up balance theory? As I showed, the strength of the structural and social psychological version of balance theory is that basic propositions of both versions are relatively well confirmed, and they provide plausible explanations of numerous social phenomena. The previous application of explaining the Protestant Reformation confirms this. So balance theory is actually a law-like statement, or one could also say an empirical regularity. I show this with one example. Look again here at the Reformation, and I said this is balanced, but it was not consistent with the situation of Luther. However, there is a lot of research that shows, I quote from a paper of Maes and Flacher from 2013, this shows individuals seek to accentuate differences between themselves and negative evaluated others. So this is a negative evaluated other, and these are differences between these two. So this shows that this is really what people do. So, and this is plausible. If you really hate somebody, it's satisfying if you find that this person has quite different ideas than you, and maybe you are searching for finding more different ideas. So you see here, that is completely consistent with balance theory. And so that means that balance theory is actually a law-like statement that can be applied to many situations. So the previous analysis is a theory integration. And it is shown that the one theory, the purposive actor model, corrects another theory. And that is often the case, not only in the social sciences. There is a famous example from an article by Karl Popper from 1957, The Aim of Science. And he argues that Newton's theory corrects the theories of Kepler and Galileo. It corrects them by explaining them. And the latter theories are good approximations of Luther theories. And you can further apply these approximations. In the social sciences, one of the first authors who had similar claims was Andrei Malevsky. He was a Polish sociologist. He lived at the time of communism, and he committed suicide at a very young age. And a book by him came out in 1967, unfortunately in German, translations Behavior and Interaction. And he showed in detail in 1967 that general behavior theories, and he takes learning theories, dissonance theory, correct specific theories of the middle range. But these specific theories, for example, status inconsistency theory, are further applied in the social sciences. So, and it has been shown that such an approximation is balance theory that provides numerous fruitful explanations. Now, further research is needed. As usual, many of what I have presented here needs to be tested empirically. What I think would be most urgent is a sort of agent-based modeling. That means that a model should be programmed that includes various assumptions of balance theory, and that can be used to derive hypotheses about such complicated social processes as the Protestant Reformation. And what I would like is a computer program for determining balance and unbalance. In counting the number of positive and negative cycles of the large graphs with 4 or 5 people, it took me a lot of time to count all this, to check it, and then to come up with the results here. So having a computer program for determining balance would be very useful. And I think I have to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack here. If you have any questions or comments, please use the
Stop.
Yeah, perfect. Please use the raise hand function. So
I don't hear you.